Shavua Tov. I was reading the Parashat today in the annual cycle, specifically the beginning of Parashat Matot, and I thought the topic with which the Parasha begins, which is the matter of the cancellation of vows, might be an interesting one just to comment on simply and briefly in connection with a passing comment on other current events going on here in Israel. So I was riding the train home from Tel Aviv after work on Thursday. And there were a bunch of other people on the train who were headed to the airport to go and demonstrate there and disrupt things. And so I got to have an up-and-close view of different T-shirts people were wearing with different kinds of slogans and mottos that have been produced as part of the campaign of rhetoric surrounding the demonstrations against the judicial reform here. And there's a variety of different slogans that you encounter. I think one that I've seen in several versions, especially more recently, there are ones that are making some kind of declaration saying, we'll never allow you to take away women's rights. And what I find interesting about that is how third order it is, meaning that the actual legislation that people are arguing about right now has nothing directly to do with any particular issue, right? It's just changing procedure in law. It's changing the specific law, that's maybe the closest to being passed right now is about whether or not the Supreme Court can use a certain criterion called reasonableness to review and disagree with either actions of members of government or legislation that the government tries to pass. And the number of different steps you have to take in order to look at a change in that kind of a procedural question and come to the conclusion that this is some kind of attack, for example, on women's rights or on rights of other kinds of people, all the different kinds of things. There's a whole lot of assumptions that obviously get baked into a standard view of someone wearing a T-shirt like that in order for that to make sense, because a priori, as we said, we're just talking about what rules the Supreme Court has to obey. You really have to somehow be in the know, or I don't know if that's a overly generous characterization, but at any rate, you have to have a very well-arranged worldview, let's say, in order for you to immediately understand why it is that someone's saying, I would like to limit the Supreme Court's power to use the criterion of reasonableness to review a law or the action of a minister or whatever, to see how that somehow, what follows from that must be some kind of attack on the rights of women. I obviously don't think that limiting the Supreme Court's power in this particular way especially has anything to do with the rights of women. But to give people the chance to have their argument heard, one would suppose that the way that this is supposed to work is that anything that you do to cut back on the currently quite substantial, or let's say not even really fully delimited power of the Supreme Court here in Israel, you're going to shift the balance towards mass democracy and away from the enlightened regulation of democracy by the protectors of everyone's rights. That's the view of what the court is doing, that to put things in the most favorable terms possible. And that as a result of that, you expose many different kinds of people to the depredations of the democratic will, which might at some point lead to retrenchments in the rights of this group or the rights of that group. And when you add to that the familiarity people have with their neighbors and their cousins, other Jews, and some of whom are religious, and people's impressions that they've therefore formed of the religious Jewish world, that somehow it has less up-to-date and with it and 21st century views about the roles of men and women, perhaps. So goes the accusation. And we'll talk about the reality in a moment, but so goes the accusation. Then more mass democracy in a country with lots of people who maybe are too religious and too inspired by the standards of Torah. It's not just a risk, but let's say an inevitability that if you limit the court in any way, that you're going to shift the balance towards retrenchment of women's rights. So I think, I didn't get to have a whole pilpul with someone on the train about this to make them explain themselves. Why are you wearing this T-shirt, and why do you think what's going on right now has anything to do with that? But this is me doing the best that I can to try to simulate the argument. And having grown up in a very liberal household that wasn't at all religiously observant, I think I have some ability to put myself in those shoes. So I'll say, by the way, that you do hear things in rhetoric from protest leaders and other people that line up with this, in the sense that the focus is all on the empirical facts of who the different factions or parties are in the Israeli political system, and the presumptions about what the other one is going to do if they just get a little more power. So this isn't very high-flown and theoretical. I heard in a recent panel on TV, people arguing about judicial reform, and one of the protest leaders literally made the following argument, that someone about reasonableness in particular as a criterion for the Supreme Court that's too sort of wishy-washy and open-ended, it gives too much power to the court. They said, well, this wasn't even a criterion that was really allowed for the court, or it wasn't invented as part of Israeli jurisprudence before a certain year. So was it the case that Israel was a dictatorship before that? Because the claim, of course, is if we remove that criterion now, then we're going to become a dictatorship. So were we one before? And the answer, plainly given by this protest leader, without needing to think about it too much, was no, because then there was a reasonable government, which is a comically naive way of approaching this, because what it exposes is a naked willingness to view all of this in terms of the hand-to-hand combat or tug of war of grappling for political power on a moment-by-moment basis, right? These are not James Madisons and Alexander Hamiltons or whoever that we're dealing with here, who are thinking about what would be a system of government that would make sense over time as the democratic will sort of sloshes back and forth for being more one way or more another way, and where you want to create a system that creates stability and continuity and that has some kind of underlying coherence to it, even as laws get made one way or another way within that sort of embracing framework. That's not seemingly how a lot of people are thinking about this. It's much more, well, right now, the government is too right-wing or too religious, too Jewish, whatever it is. And given that that's the case, that if also we retrench the power of the Supreme Court, that will deliver more power into the hands of the wrong people. And they might do some things that I don't like, or that my faction doesn't like, or what have you. And so therefore it needs to be stopped. So it's this 1-2 thing where you can't really argue that a relatively isolated, or I don't know, let's say a particular modification in the norms surrounding what the court can use as criteria for making a decision, that if you just change that, then the whole country turns into some kind of nightmarish authoritarian regime overnight. You can't make that argument on the basis of some kind of study of constitutional law. But when we add to that the fact that, oh yeah, and right now the people in power are ones that I don't like, then I think the worst of how those two effects will combine, and off we go to the rhetoric of fear-mongering and denunciation. So in any case, I think if I understand correctly, the notion is, if we tamper at all with the way the court operates currently, and somehow at the end of that process, the court has less power than it currently does. It has currently massive open-ended powers that are not really delimited in law, and has over time arrogated more powers to itself because they're not delimited in law. So it's not necessarily on a path to maintain the amount of power that it has, but rather, if we follow this historical process, it's on a path to keep on amassing more power to itself. But if anyone tries to stop that process, and at the same time, they're also someone I quoted, I, so to speak, meaning I, the presumably more left-wing demonstrators, someone I disagree with about their politics, then I'm going to call that kind of constitutional modification the equivalent of dictatorship. And the specific accusation is that this will be a full frontal assault immediately on all sorts of different kinds of people's rights, because we know that that's what this other political faction in the Israeli electorate wants. If where there's no giving the other side the benefit of the doubt, there's no trust, there's just, well, if they're too right-wing or too religious, then of course the moment they get a hair's breadth more power, they're going to use it to try to tear down women's rights. So the reasoning goes. And so you put on the t-shirt and you go block the airport. So maybe we can come back to current events more at the end, but I think all of this is in a sense just a preface to a brief look into something from Parashat Matot about the cancellation of vows that I think is a little bit pertinent here, just to the general question of how does the Torah view the relationship between men and women? How does the Torah view the equivalence or non-equivalence of men and women? Because clearly, of course, that is in principle potentially a different question than how we would, or let's say we would answer the question differently if, rather than looking into the Torah, we looked at how different kinds of Jews, and particularly religious Jews, behave, right? So one must acknowledge that a theory of how this is supposed to work in the Torah is not necessarily the same thing as how people act. People are more familiar with random anecdotes of how their cousins act or whatever. And so some, let's say, consideration has to be given to that additional perspective. But I'd like to talk from the standpoint of the Torah, how things should be, and talk also just in kind of high level terms. Like, we'll talk about a few sources, but not with a mind to go too deeply into them. I think the first source that people are widely aware of in the Torah that gives you some sense of how the Torah views men and women is in Maaseh Brishit. When people are created, they are both created b'tselem Elohim. It says Zachar u'nekeva bara otam, right? Hashem made both men and women in his image. And so in the 7 days of creation, the description of the creation of human beings, in contrast with the rest of the animal kingdom, there's a specific mention made of Zachar u'nekeva, male and female, that they were created in God's image, and they were created male and female, and that those are juxtaposed. And I don't think that is at all to be discounted. We shouldn't take it for granted. It's Vayivra Elohim et Adam betzalmo b'tzelem Elohim bara oto Zachar u'nekeva bara otam. There's this repetition of bara otam in order to try to really make clear that this is one thing, that in one sense we're talking about the creation of humanity or the human being in God's image, but that there's this necessity to acknowledge that there's different kinds of human beings, and that's juxtaposed exactly with this notion of being made in the image of God. And so the basic point here is that both men and women, male and female human beings, are created b'tzelem Elohim. Now, that doesn't devolve into a whole lot of clear halachic implications, but it's a high-level principle that I think gets us off to a good start in how to think about this. I think the main difficulty that people have coming from a more Western and liberal perspective, and a very modern one, once we take things from here in the Torah, is that having it be the case that both female and male human beings are made b'tzelem Elohim, in the image of God, it doesn't automatically follow that they are identical in all their characteristics, or that they ought to be therefore dealt with exactly the same and as total equivalents in all respects in the Torah. Because it can be the case that they can both be made b'tzelem Elohim, but that they can be made differently b'tzelem Elohim. And really, this is something that's referenced more generally by Chazal elsewhere in the Midrash, because there's this notion that when a king makes a coin in his image, every coin comes out the same, but when HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes a coin in his image, every person comes out different, right? Or each person is a coin, right? And so we're all made b'tzelem Elohim, we're all unique and different, and those are two non-contradicting concepts because of the manifoldness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's oneness. And that also can be true at the level of the difference between male and female. So there can be equivalence in value or in some overall kind of divine spark that we possess, but it can still be the case that men and women are not the same in all regards. Enough so, at least, that when we're talking about laws in the Torah, it's not automatically the case that all laws just pertain to abstract human being independent of gender. There are laws that pertain differently to women than to men. And the one I wanted to talk to from Parashat Matot certainly has that property. And so we'll just read a little bit of this, and it's a passage that maybe we can eventually just switch over to reading English because it's a little long, but just to get through the cases. So this is about people swearing vows. Ish ki yidor neder l'Adonai, o hishav'a shvu'a le'asor isar al nafsho, lo yahel dvaro kechol hayotze mepiu ya'aseh. If a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. U'isha ki tidor neder l'Adonai, u'asara isar beveit aviha b'ne'oreha, u'sham'a aviha et nidara, u'esara asher asara al nafsha, u'herish lah אביה, וכמו כל נדריה, וכל איסר אשר אסרה על נפשה יקום. And her father hears her vow and her bond, with which, I should say, if a woman also vows a vow to the Lord and binds herself by being a bond, by a bond, being in her father's house in her youth, and her father hears her vow and her bond, which she has bound her soul, and her father shall hold his peace at her, then all her vows shall stand, and every bond with which she has bound her soul shall stand. But if her father disallows her in that day that he hears not one of her vows, okay, so now I'm getting into the next pasuk. So, ve'im hini aviha ota b'yom sham'o kol nidareha ve'esareha asher asara al nafshah lo yakum va'adonai yislah lah ki hini aviha ota. But if her father disallows her in the day that he hears not one of her vows or of her bonds with which she has bound her soul shall stand, and the Lord shall forgive her because her father disallowed her. And then the source goes on to also cover the case where the woman is married, and then this same role is transferred from the woman's father to her husband, where again, if he hears her with the first moment that he hears about a vow that she has made, if he holds his peace, then she is like a man in that she's made a vow to God and she has to keep it. But he has the option to, on the spot, cancel the vow and release her from the vow, if he decides that that's suitable, and then in that case, she doesn't have to keep her vow. I think what's fascinating about this source is that, on the one hand, when you hear it for the first time, and if you have the ears of someone schooled in the 20th and 21st century Western liberal secular atmosphere, right? You hear it and you immediately have this allergic reaction, because an asymmetry, first of all, any kind of asymmetry is being created between men and women. And in addition, I would say it's not even based directly on the differences in biology. So I think, if you make there are other laws in the Torah that pertain to childbirth. And I think it's still the case that it rankles less to that same ear to hear a law that handles the case of childbirth and doesn't say, if a woman gives birth or if a man gives birth, because when we're thinking about the generation to which the Torah was given, no one was really putting forward the idea that that issue could be such a complicated discussion. And so, we said, okay, women, they're the ones who can bear children. It's understood that the Torah can be speaking about that issue, and maybe there are things that have to do with childbirth that you need to handle in the law, and it's not automatically, I think, as much going to bother someone listening, saying, oh, it's creating some kind of inequivalence. However, in this law that we're talking about, it's about vows. So it's about something very cerebral, very abstract, very, whereas, let's say, childbirth, again, or in biology, that's universal to the animal kingdom. Oath swearing is particular to humanity. And so it is very much about our humanity and our relationships with people and with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in that context, there is something literally paternalistic about this law, because what it's saying is, all right, so if a man makes an oath, he's bound by the oath. And it doesn't say, and if his mother hears about it, then she can cancel the oath. Or if his father hears about it, then he can cancel the oath. And it doesn't say that a woman's mother can cancel her oath. It says a woman's father, if he hears about the oath, he can cancel the oath. Or a woman's husband, if he hears about the oath, he can cancel the oath. And so at a basic level, there is an asymmetry here, but in addition, it's an asymmetry that sounds like it is giving a kind of authority to either the father or the husband to overrule the woman, which obviously sounds very disturbing to the ear of a 20th or 21st century Western liberal, because that sounds like a law that originates from a patriarchal ancient culture in which there were different amounts of power given to men and women, and this is a law that is giving a man power over a woman. So of course it must be wrong, and we sort of hear it. It produces the allergic reaction, and we're supposed to dismiss it and not think more about it. Now, this is not the sum total of all the laws in the Torah that pertain to issues between men and women, so it's obviously a longer discussion. But I think what's interesting about this one in particular is that when you look at more closely at it, what power is the man being given here? This is not a law saying, and the Torah could have said this if it wanted to, and it didn't, and we have to take that very seriously. The Torah did not say, and when a woman lives in her father's house, she must obey her father in everything. And when a woman lives in a house with her husband, then she must obey her husband in everything. That's not in the Torah. That's not Torah. It's not something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to live by in a simple and rigid way. It's not stated black on white in the Chumash, because things are more complicated than that. And what this law instead is doing, quite interestingly, is the power that the man is being given is to set the woman free, right? She has taken an oath upon herself, which is about really a relationship between her and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. She's made an oath to Hashem. And there is a power of judicial review, let's say, that's being given either to her father or to her husband to look into the question of whether this oath makes sense, and then say, you've placed this constraint on yourself. And if a man had done so, there would be, I won't say nothing to do for him, because actually we have a whole Masechet in the Talmud about Nedarim, about oaths, and there are instances where you can cancel oaths, but it's not straightforward. And the basic point, if you read just this pasuk in the Torah, or this passage, it sounds like the man is stuck. He made an oath, and now he has to fulfill his oath to Hashem. The woman has also made an oath. She's constrained by that. She's taken something upon herself that in some way chains her or ties her hands. And the man, the father or the husband, has not been given the power to chain her. It doesn't give us a mitzvah in the Torah that says, and if a man decides he wants to swear an oath to Hashem about what his wife has to do, then he can do that. Also something we don't get, didn't make the cut. So she has the power to constrain herself in her relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then what HaKadosh Baruch Hu says is, fine, if she wants to be chaining herself, then I want to give the man in her life, whether it's her father or her husband, the sort of male authority figure, the chance to set her free if he thinks that that's better. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in a sense, is giving he's outsourcing the decision in a way that is really about liberation and really about removal of constraint. So it's really quite a fascinatingly balanced mitzvah in the sense that it both, I would say, I don't know if it's more so than anything else in the Torah, but certainly it's up there, raises the visage of patriarchal authority, in which it seems like a power of control is being given to a man over a woman. And yet the only way in which he's been given that control is in the power to set her free from a constraint she placed on herself that pertains to her relationship with Hashem. And I partly just marvel at how HaKadosh Baruch Hu simultaneously in this mitzvah is trying to both admit that men and women are not entirely identical, and that difference is not merely biological, but extends up to the level of these more cerebral and abstract things that make us uniquely human, where we don't necessarily assume by default with a simple, sweeping principle that in all ways, men and women in the Torah should be dealt with identically, and that we can't have any ability to distinguish between them. But that in that moment where that really is getting pushed under our nose, the actual power that's being granted to the man is just women's liberation, right? It's setting the woman free from a constraint that she had placed on herself. And that's the only subject of discussion here. So that on its own is already, I think, quite interesting, because the Torah is giving us, I think, a quite subtly balanced message of saying, look, men and women are not equivalent, but we don't, because of that, immediately just create some huge imbalance of power between them. It's more that we need to treat them in ways that have sensitivity to the ways in which they are archetypally different. But now the question is, what is the way that we're treating them different, and why does it make sense? What is it telling us? And there I think it's maybe more of a bit more of a speculative discussion. The case again that we're considering is the swearing of a vow, and you have to ask yourself, who would do this in the first place? What would this be? Why would someone swear a vow? And we see some examples of that in Tanakh. Actually, we see a highly critical, anti-patriarchal example of that in Tanakh that's quite famous. That's maybe the clearest, which is that of Yiftach, right? Yiftach, the Shofet, in Sefer Shoftim, swears an oath to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that if he's given victory over his enemies and allowed to return home b'shalom, in peace, that he will make a korban, an offering to Hashem, out of the first thing to greet him as he walks back through his door, or what walks through his door to greet him, perhaps. And then it turns out to be his daughter that comes out to greet him. So there we see a man swearing an oath, first of all, that he shouldn't swear, which he then feels bound by. So it's partly demonstrating the stupidity of swearing an oath to Hashem. This is something that we also learn both from Chazal and from elsewhere in Tanakh, more explicitly, I think in Kohelet, for example, that you should not be casual about swearing oaths to Hashem, and maybe it's just a better idea not to do it at all. But there's a recognition somehow of the tendency that people have to want to do it. So maybe you need to make laws about it. But first of all, it's the man making the oath here, it's being foolish, and foolish in a way that ultimately may lead to human sacrifice and or murder, although it's a little bit unclear in the text whether that actually happens, but it certainly puts him in a situation where he feels like maybe he's obligated to engage in those activities, which makes him one of the worst people in Tanakh by a certain standard, because Tanakh is all about how human sacrifice is basically the worst thing you can do. And also that specifically, it's not just that he made a stupid vow, it's that he's a father and the victim of his stupidity is his daughter. So it's precisely showing this imbalance of power and, his responsibility for her, and that it was his job to protect her, and instead he put her in danger because of the stupidity of his vow. So if we're looking, in Tanakh, we don't have to look hard to find a commentary on this dynamic that's looking at it in reverse. It's looking at the vow that a father is making and how foolish vows can be, and how when a father makes a vow, because he's, the warrior returning from battle, and he is the sort of the strong man whose job it is to protect everyone, his vows can have disastrous consequences because of how quickly they can harm the vulnerable who depend on him. But I think that we should also be asking what kind of a vow a woman might make, such that somehow it would be more necessary that her father or husband would perhaps need to set her free from it. And I think one answer to that could be that it is kind of about the sort of politics and economics of the household, meaning that when conceiving of the household in terms that would be obvious to the Torah and the generation it was given, you had a lot of, let's say, division of labor between giving birth to children and raising children on the one hand with the women, and the acquisition of food and the provision of defense by the men. And obviously that was always more complicated. In the present day, it's even more complex in terms of how people balance those things. But the core, the Tanakh is always really interested in the essence of the human condition. If you strip away all the layers of socially constructed tissue that we put on top and sort of say like, all right, brass tacks, given agriculture, given human biology, what are things going to be like if we're near the state of nature and we're trying to find a way of lifting ourselves morally up out of that? And in that condition, those were, not just archetypally, but probably even almost universally the differences in roles between men and women, certainly in the society we're talking about, but also more generally among humanity at that time. So given that that's the case, you could say that part of what's going on there is just that, again, oaths are constraints. And if someone makes an oath to Hashem, that's sort of like they've, chained themselves to a bulldozer or whatever, right? Like they have created a constraint where now you still are dealing with them, but now since they're more constrained, you're more constrained. So if you're a shepherd and most of what the food you consume in your house is, I don't know, milk from sheep or things made in, cheese is made from milk from sheep or I don't know what. And then your wife or your daughter swears an oath saying she's never going to eat a dairy product ever again. That can be a problem, right? Because you can't just say, okay, fine, break your oath to Hashem, if it can't be canceled. If a man swore such an oath, then you wouldn't be able to say, okay, well, then you should break your oath because this is idiotic. This is the food that we have. Then you would say, okay, fine, you should keep your oath. We have to figure out a way of having you not being malnourished all the time. That hugely impacts the way we have to organize our whole household. And this is very difficult. So you could say there are things like that where it's not even really about the decision making that needs review. That somehow the Torah isn't necessarily implying that somehow the woman is less likely to make a good decision about what oaths she swears. And we don't need any, again, further examples besides Yiftach to understand that Tanakh as a whole is aware that men can make very bad decisions about the oaths they swear. But it's more that there may be more kind of household level problems that need solving as a result of constraints. And so you need like the person who is providing for defense and sustenance to be able to review things just in order to make sure it doesn't, bring the whole ship down. So I think that's one way of reading it. I think we also can ask again, is the Torah making also a psychological judgment? Meaning, is there something different at all, archetypally perhaps, about men and women in terms of why they would swear an oath or what kind of oath they would take? And there we have to tread more carefully because again, I don't think the point is exactly that women are somehow going to make worse decisions about the oaths that they make. But it's more that it might be that they more often find themselves in situations that require a huge amount of focus on the present moment and the willingness to do anything for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu taking notice of the situation and helping. Now, I think the classic and obvious example of this, which can't be the only one because it wouldn't be happening when a woman is younger in her father's household, is pregnancy and childbirth, right? Again, especially going back to the time and place in which the Torah was given. I mean, it's still the case, even today, with all of our technology, that childbirth is not straightforward and easy, and it is often still quite scary. But it used to be the case, much more so, that anytime a woman was bearing children, that it was like she was taking her life in her hands, right? That it was much more common for women to die in childbirth from complications. And as a result, you can imagine, and not only that, I would say, but also just in terms of women playing such a large role in caring for children, that even once the children are born, they instinctually and also in terms of the traditional role would be the sort of the front line of trying to save a child if the child is in trouble, right? If the child is sick, for example. And I think it's fair to say that there's a archetypal psychological profile that may accompany that biology. And all one needs to say about it is that it's perhaps a greater willingness to say, there's a problem right now, and it might mean that a child is going to die or that I'm going to die, and that's such a regular part of the direct experience of the woman, that she's going to have a greater inclination to be saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'll give you anything. I'll do anything to show you that I have realized my wrongs and that I'm doing tshuva, whatever it is, because I need your intervention. I need your salvation. I need your acknowledgement in this moment. And we see all sorts of examples of that connected with the primacy of women in childbirth and in child rearing, whether it's that you have Hannah praying in the temple because she wants to bear children and she can't, where she has she swears an oath to Hashem that she'll make her son, who turns out to be Shmuel Hanavi, a Nazir when he is born, and we can generalize from that to a woman who isn't married, but without being married, she won't be able to have children. She won't have kind of her life can't be launched in the concept again of the world of Tanakh, and perhaps arguably in the present day in the religious Jewish world, and we can come back to that at the end, or at least it's much more difficult to imagine how if you don't get to get married and start having a family. That's a very essential idea, right? And so once you view things in that frame, you could say, maybe what this is about is trying to give the woman more freedom in her relationship and in her relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and in her tefillah, that Hashem is saying to her, I don't want you to feel like your hands are tied at all in what you promised to me in some moment of desperation where a child is dying of fever, chas v'chalila, or where you're afraid that you're about to have a stillborn delivery or die before delivering the child, or all these other things that were almost everyday occurrences thousands of years ago and still today have not been totally removed from the biology of the human condition, despite all of our technology. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is really about HaKadosh Baruch Hu going to women and saying that there is a need for women to be more free than men, to not have to worry about the consequences of what they promised to Hashem, because he wants to, in a sense, be able to give them the zchut of making the promise, but also to immediately have it be the case that it can be canceled because it was promising too much, or it was promising the wrong thing, or all the things that you might do in a moment of terror, in a moment of desperation. And in order to emphasize that dynamic exactly, it then makes sense that it's either the father or the husband that's doing this kind of judicial review, right? Because archetypally, then we're saying that the male in the similar situation, or in an adjacent situation of the family, will have a related perspective, but a different one on what's going on. And it isn't the case that the oath just is canceled because she's a woman all the time. Women can make oaths that don't get canceled. But if that doesn't make sense to either the father or the husband, there's a chance to kind of be licensed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to cancel the oath, because the best situation would be that the woman gets the zchut of making the promise to Hashem, and at the same time also isn't necessarily going to be obligated by it, because she can be freed by the judgment of someone who sees things from a different perspective that's not more correct, but is one that leads to greater freedom for her, which is what Hashem ultimately wants to grant her, and what her husband or her father is being tasked with giving her, greater freedom. So that doesn't cover everything about men and women in the Torah, but I think more than any other mitzvah that pertains to relationships between men and women, it maybe makes the most clear that at a moment when it most seems like this is really about a difference in authority. What the Torah chooses to do is to say to the man, the power you have over your woman, whether it's your daughter or your wife, is just to make her more free. And that you need to internalize, and that can infect the dynamic of the rest of your relationship. That this is not about giving the man greater power to domineer. It's about remembering HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there between them, and that really this is about what he wants, and that men and women each have different roles to play in making a successful project together, each by seeking a certain relationship with Hashem and with each other with his blessing.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.